Hello and welcome. We will be starting in a couple minutes. We just want to give everyone a chance to join. Thank you. Welcome everyone. Let's get started.
Thanks so much for joining today. This is the first in a series, upcoming series of webinars all about the science of reading. So we're just really glad that you could join us today. Today we're going to give an overall sort of context setting about what an effective literacy program is all about. And just a couple of housekeeping items before we get going. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be emailed to everybody who registered. So if you have to jump off early, if you have to step away for a little while, no worries. You'll get a recording in your inbox after this is done. And if you're having any technical difficulties, I've got some friends on the other end of the line, so just let us know in that questions panel. We can try to help you. You may need to restart Zoom too, but again, no worries if you miss part of the webinar. It is being recorded, so you can go back and listen. And finally, we're going to be answering some questions at the end of the webinar today. So as we're going through, please send them in the questions panel at any time, and then we'll stop at the end and do a little Q&A. So before we get too far into this, I just really love to know who we have out there in our audience today. So I'm going to ask Matt again to actually launch this poll so we can see who all is here. So if you could just take a minute to select the appropriate response, one that best fits you. Are you a district leader, a building leader, a coach, an interventionist, classroom teacher, or some other category that doesn't quite fit into any of those? So go ahead and take some time to answer and submit. It's always interesting to know who our audience is. It looks like we have 220 plus participants, so that's amazing. All right, so results of our poll. It looks like we have a lot of folks that are associating in that other category. It would be great if we would have been a little more specific, I guess, about that, but I'm so glad that you're here and joining us. A good amount of district building leadership, interventionists, and classroom teachers. Just really appreciate, again, you being here and joining us for today's webinar. And I know that in past webinars, we've had folks that have actually used the recording of this to share with staff. And so I'm sure you'll find some creative ways to share the message. All right, so a little bit about me. I could have put a beautiful headshot on here, and I decided, no, you know what? I'm going to show a picture of the real Susan Lambert. I am a vice president of early literacy instruction here at Amplify. And this is my sidekick husband who we go on adventures all the time. So when I'm not thinking about early literacy, I'm thinking about other places in the world. And this is just our most recent trip to Hawaii. This is actually Kauai, the first time I've ever been there. And I saw more rainbows. This is actually a real rainbow in the background. The most beautiful things that, that we've ever seen, rainbows from sort of end to end. Just maybe one or two more things about me. I think it's important for you to know that I'm actually a former classroom teacher, former principal, former director of curriculum and assessment. And so I grew up in the ranks of education. Really, really important to me that we are reminded that the thing that is most important in the work that we do are the students that we actually serve. And so all of my work is really focused on that sort of classroom view and practitioner view. Couple of slides around context, because I'm not sure how many of you have actually been with us in either past presentations or past webinars. I just wanted to just take a few minutes to remind us of why we're here in this place now, talking about the science of reading, and what is the context around us that has sort of brought us to this place. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Hard Words podcast. Emily Hanford has done a series. Now she's got 4 of podcast series that have really highlighted this issue of why aren't kids being taught to read? What is it in the local classroom context that is actually keeping kids from achieving and sort of driving these NAEP results that we've seen flatlined for several decades? And APM Report sort of contextualized her podcast series this way, that scientific research has shown how children learn to read and how they should be taught, but many educators don't know this science. Some of them actively resist it. Many aren't trained in it. And so as a result, millions of kids are really being set up to fail. And this is sort of part 1 then of what is that scientific research? Why isn't it being delivered to kids? If we know how kids learn how to read and we know how they should be taught, why isn't it happening? So this was, let's see, 2018, so about a year and a half ago now. And quickly following that, there was a series of articles that came out in Ed Week. This one happened to be from March 7th, 2019, that really highlighted then this idea of a national reading crisis. And within this article, and this got a lot of traction, a lot of attention, a lot of conversation, but the folks that authored this particular article actually pulled out like 5 essential insights that they saw both in their work and in their work within their school districts, as well as they were digging into this research. And these 5 things are really about grouping students by reading level that's poorly supported by research, that teachers tend to overspend instructional time on skills and strategies, a reminder about background knowledge being essential to reading comprehension. We've heard a lot about that recently, very recently. But that research has been around for a while. This idea that daily systematic phonics instruction is really recommended, really important for students to develop as proficient readers, and proven strategies to get kids working with grade level text must be employed. So these 5 essentials really came out of this article. And so, these are 2 of some critical pieces that sort of help us get to this place of why we are talking so much about the science of reading. What should that look like in schools? How do we get teachers to employ those strategies? And how do we sort of build a system of early literacy to ensure that all students are on track to be proficient readers? So that's a bit of the context. We really have 4 goals today. We're going to talk a little bit about what we mean by the science of reading. Some of you probably joined me for a webinar we did this fall, or have maybe heard some things on the podcast. We're going to just do a brief review to give us some context and sort of springboard from there. And then we're going to talk about the elements of an effective literacy program. What needs to be in place to ensure that we're starting students early and we're setting them on a track for success. We'll talk a bit about alignment and why alignment among instruction, intervention, and assessment is really critical to be efficient in this literacy program. And then we're going to end by talking about some principles of reading science. So let's dive in and let's start, like I said, with the science of reading. And so before we get going, I just want to put up a little quiz. Actually, Madigan's going to help me with that. But let's just do a little quiz to see what you already know about the science of reading or reading science. So the simple view of reading. Just read through those choices and select the one that you think is best describes this simple view of reading. We'll give you just a few more seconds. Read through those. All right. And I can tell my audience really knows something about the simple view of reading. So it's all of these things. It's really based on research from cognitive science, and now it's actually being studied in neuroscience, and we're getting lots of affirmations about that from between cognitive and neuroscience. It does describe what it takes to become a proficient reader, and we'll unpack that in just a minute. It is often represented by a multiplication equation, and we'll talk about why it's not additive and why it's a product. And it involves these two things called language comprehension and word recognition. So 68% of you, congratulations. You're well on your way to understanding the science of reading and the simple view of reading. So let's get those things to come together for us. So the simple view of reading. When we talk about reading science or the science of reading, what we're talking about is this idea of the simple view of reading. This simple view of reading is based on decades worth of cognitive science, again, that's being reaffirmed, extended through neuroscience. And basically the simple view of reading says that in order to be a proficient reader, it's really the product of two things: language comprehension and word recognition. And again, you notice this is represented as a multiplication problem, or again, reading proficiency is the product of both of these things. What's important about the way that that's represented in terms of the equation is that you cannot do more practice in word recognition to make up for the lack of language comprehension you may have, and vice versa. You cannot do more in language comprehension to make up for word recognition. So if we were doing this as a real math problem, if we had 10 in the area of language comprehension and 0 in the area of word recognition, our reading proficiency would actually be 0. So it's important to remember that there are two things that have to be developed in order for us to be proficient readers. And again, just another slide reminding us that you can't do more decoding practice to make up for a lack of language comprehension, and the other way around. So sometimes we might hear the science of reading is all about decoding or phonics or that word recognition side of the equation, and that's actually not true. It takes both of these things to develop reading proficiency. So let's unpack them really quickly. Many of you already know what this entails, but again, this will just level set us, get us all on the same playing field here, so then we can extend to talk about then what this looks like as we put together an efficient literacy program. So let's start with language comprehension. This is all about the ability to understand oral language. This develops naturally. So this is something that kids start to develop the minute they're born, some say before they're born, because it starts by them hearing adults and other kids and other people just interact and talk, and them listening to that, and then starting to learn how to talk. And so this is the place that we build background knowledge, we start to understand vocabulary, we understand how those things work in sentences, we make connections between sentences so that we can have gists of conversations and be able to talk back and forth. The important thing to remember about language comprehension is it actually is natural, develops naturally. This is in the oral language environment. We are then later going to apply that to the written word, but we first start with oral language. When we think about language comprehension, it's something that should continue to grow throughout your life. So you should continue to be adding new vocabulary, getting new background knowledge, and so language comprehension is something that's sort of eternal. Word recognition, the other side of the equation here, or the other factor in the equation, is the ability then to recognize written words correctly. And so this means that when kids come to us, they understand the concept of sounds because that is developed naturally. But what we need to teach them is we need to teach them how sounds are represented by letters or combinations of letters, and how these letters and combinations of letters then work together to make words. This part of the simple view of reading is not natural. This is the part that we have to explicitly teach students to take them from what they already know, sounds, into the world that they don't yet know, which is how those sounds are represented in the written language. The word recognition element of the simple view of reading is one that you don't continue to learn, right? You learn it once, and then we want you to become really fluent in it. We want you to have great word recognition so that we can take that cognitive energy out of the word recognition part of this and put that then into comprehension. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's another way for us to look at or view the simple view of reading. This is actually called Scarborough's rope, developed by Hollis Scarborough to sort of highlight then what does this look like when students are learning how to read. What is it that are the elements of the language comprehension part and the word recognition part? And you can see just by this visual that language comprehension is a little more involved. Again, this is the part that we continue to develop over and over again, and the word recognition part really is something that's a little more discrete, that we are going to teach and we're going to assume that kids are going to learn it, and so then we're going to take that cognitive energy and put it into the language comprehension side or into the reading comprehension side. And you can see then when kids start to develop these things, we want to develop them pretty discreetly, but they get woven together over time, and you and I, who are very proficient readers, we can comprehend really well. We have these threads woven together so tightly that often we don't recognize what we're doing in terms of automaticity or strategically approaching a text because it's been practiced, our brains have been rewired, and we're just able to approach a text without thinking about this. Again, a point here of clarification that is often misrepresented as we're talking about the science of reading is that word recognition, or the phonic side of this, is super important, but it's important so that we don't have to use it over time, that we can become increasingly automatic or fluent in our approach to text, but it's not the only element of becoming a proficient reader. Language comprehension is also an important element. So that's sort of the high level, quick view. Again, if you want more information on the simple view of reading or Scarborough's rope, you can Google that. You can come to us on the Facebook page, which I'll talk about at the end of this webinar, or listen to some of our podcasts. You can go to the Emily Hanford podcast. They're a great place to get this information. But just a reminder that reading ability is the result of a combination of both decoding and language comprehension. So that's great research and great to talk about at a high level, but what does that look like then when we walk into a school and want to understand how we can then put these elements in place to ensure that we have an effective literacy program? So let's unpack some of the vocabulary before we get into the details of this. And let's first talk about what I mean when I say effective literacy program. And this idea of program is not what's the curriculum you're going to put in the classroom. It's actually a set of related activities or multiple things that all come together to help us get to a long-term aim. What I didn't put in this deck is a slide that reminds us about what our NAEP scores are nationally for the last 3 decades or longer, because I think we're all pretty much aware that our proficiencies are not that great by the time kids get to 4th grade. And so I think we would think about our long-term aim, or our aim being getting all students on track to be grade level readers. And so if we're thinking about that, we're going to think about what are all the things in our literacy program that we have to put in place to be able to get there. And I like to talk about this word efficient too, because we need to create this system that will help us achieve maximum productivity. And by productivity, I mean those things that help us get to that reading proficiency. And we don't want to waste anything, because we don't have time to waste, we don't have money to waste, and we have to get all of our resources sort of put together in the same way to have this well-organized machine that we can sort of prevent then wasting any of those resources that we need to have to get us there. We're going to come back to some of these words later on, but I think it's important for us to unpack. Sometimes when we use words like, what are the elements of an effective literacy program, we forget that vocabulary is really important as it's put together with words, right? We're trying to teach that to our students, but we also want to employ those strategies as well to really do a close read and think about what this means. So, if you've been with me before, you've seen this image before. You're going to see it several more times as we talk through it. But when I talk about an effective literacy program, I'm talking about 4 key or critical elements. And that's core instruction, what happens every single day in those classrooms at grade level, what are students getting. We're going to talk about differentiated instruction and practice. We're going to talk about what that means related to the core instruction. We're going to talk a bit about intervention, and then we're going to talk about assessment or data that can tie all those things together. We're going to go through these each one at a time, but I want you to just sort of get this visual in your head as we start talking about, again, that literacy program, these elements that are going to be important for you to think about, for you to implement, for you to monitor, and how we can get all these things working together. So let's start with core instruction. We're going to start with the what of core instruction. Now, one thing that is really important is when we mean core instruction, we mean for all students. We mean effective instruction that's supported by research that all students have access to. And by access to, I mean all students are involved in that core instruction. If they need something outside of that, we're going to talk about that later, but we need to ensure that all students are receiving this. And so here's sort of the big 5. You may see themes of the National Reading Panel in here, which makes sense. We want to make sure that core instruction includes phonological and phonemic awareness, letter knowledge, and concepts of print. And phonological and phonemic awareness are super important in the early grades to start strong and to build the foundation, but we don't stop there too. We want to continue some of that phonemic awareness throughout the early grades. We want to see the alphabetic code meaning phonics and both decoding and encoding. So that's how you break apart words when you read them, and then how do you write those words? And so that needs to be part of our core instruction. We need to make sure we're paying attention to sufficient practice with that code so that students gain automaticity or fluency, right? And we want to start with that at the word level to make sure we're doing that strong mapping and like rewiring of our brain that we need to, so that again, that decoding can sort of go away to the background, because then we have turned these words into actual sight words. I would venture to guess if I ask any of you if any of these words on the screen right here you had to decode, you would probably say no, because you have sufficient practice with all of these words that they're actually sight words for you. So that's exactly what we want to do with students. We also want to pay attention to vocabulary development, and vocabulary development as it's connected to knowledge acquisition. And so if you remember back to Scarborough's rope, the idea that we have both background knowledge and vocabulary, we want to make sure that we're doing that vocabulary development, and it's not in isolation, right? Like we're talking about word mapping and we're talking about acquiring knowledge. And our instruction needs to support comprehension. And when we talk about comprehension, that's both during reading and after reading. And so we want to think about the sentence levels, what we know about how to comprehend at the sentence level, which is what happens during reading. And if at the sentence level you're not making connections or comprehension at that level, you're not going to understand sort of the after reading comprehension. So this is the idea of the differences between skills, which is during reading, and strategies, which comes after reading. So let's talk a little bit about the how. So it's not just important what you're teaching, but there's actually some research that says how you teach this is important as well. And again, a reminder, this is core instruction. This is all students supported by research. So what we know is that we know systematic instruction is important, and it should include distributed practice. What do I mean by those two things? So by systematic instruction, we mean that your instruction is going to build from the simplest to the most complex to scaffold students appropriately, and you're going to have a scope and sequence to ensure that students don't have gaps in their learning. So it shouldn't be random instruction at different grade levels and different times, but you're actually following some kind of path or progress that builds from the simplest to the most complex. Distributed practice, and what this means is that we're not going to teach it once, have kids practice, and then move on, or we're not going to teach it once and have them practice over during the same, few instructional blocks. What we want to do is we want to make sure that we loop around and have kids re-practice and build on that. So your instruction should always include an element of review and scaffold. So kids are reminded what they learned before, practice it again, and build on it subsequently. We also need to have explicit instruction with that opportunity then for individual practice or application, including the gradual release. So what do we mean by explicit instruction? What we mean by that is if we want students to understand that the two letters SH put together makes the sh sound, we just want to tell them that. We shouldn't make them guess. We shouldn't go through some kind of discovery process to try and have them figure that out. When it comes to teaching early literacy skills, we just want to tell them that's what happens, and then give them the opportunity to practice that and put that into application. And we want to do that with multisensory instruction. And this is all about engaging multiple senses to ensure we're making learning sticky. It doesn't have to be complicated. Multisensory instruction doesn't mean pulling out a tub of manipulatives or shaving cream on a desk. It can mean that, but this means actually allowing students to do things like decode words and encode words, see the sound spelling patterns, write the sound spelling patterns, and then apply them in connected text. And then the fourth thing here that's really important is we need to provide students with grade level text and then give them the support or scaffold that they need to actually engage with those texts. So if we expect kids to read at grade level, we have to provide them then the opportunity to be able to do that. All that, of course, is bundled in to instruction that happens daily in the classroom. So if you notice in this graphic, like that core instruction box is really like the biggest box here, and that's what it should be, right? Our core instruction should represent the bulk of the time that we spend instructing students. And so then what happens in differentiated instruction and practice? I don't actually like to use the word differentiated because I think it's one of those terms in education that's turned into lingo. That when we say differentiation, we think that everybody understands what it is. And I think that's not true, especially with this word. So what we mean, or what I mean when I say differentiated instruction, I mean that we're extending the core for targeted practice. So not every kid is going to learn at the same pace or with the same amount of repetition or practice. And so differentiation is based on something I've already taught in instruction. It's an extension of a lesson. And if I have a small group of students or individual students that need extra time in that instruction, need a different way to be instructed on that, then I'm going to pull them and give them more time on that topic, on that skill, on that content, as it extends from that core instruction. We also want to make sure that students get the amount of practice that they need to have to make sure that we've got automaticity for reading and writing. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is we know from the research what students need and the process that that has to happen for them to become proficient readers. Some kids, like kids that are dyslexic, need extra time in making that mapping happen. So that mapping in your brain that needs to happen for kids to be automatic and fluent. And so they don't need to necessarily have a different kind of instruction. What they need to have is more layers and of practice and more time to practice. And so that comes then directly from core instruction to giving kids extra time in instruction or extra time in practice based on their needs. And so this is a really important concept as we think about the relationship between core instruction and small group or differentiated instruction. So remember, this is all about extending the core instruction for targeted practice. Intervention is something a little bit different. And so by intervention, we mean helping close students' learning gaps. So it could be that they also need more time in practice, but this is actually additional learning time outside the core instruction. And what we need to know is we need to know, first of all, what are their gaps in learning and where are their gaps in learning? And then we need to build instruction to specifically target those gaps in their learning. Now, some kids have more gaps than others. Some kids maybe come to us in 3rd or 4th grade not having that explicit instruction in phonics, and they have a whole lot of gaps to close. Well, they should still be involved in core instruction at grade level instruction with adequate supports to help them in that core instruction. But outside of that time, we're going to target their gaps in learning, give them what they need to have to then accelerate. So time and intensity is going to vary based on their level of need. We need to accelerate their learning to get them to grade level proficiency. And what we're going to do is make sure we're frequently monitoring, assessing and monitoring that progress to get them back in grade level as quickly as possible. And so I'm just going to flip back again just to make this distinction then between what's different between differentiated instruction and practice, right? This is like taking that core instruction and giving kids extra time. And intervention is actually time outside that core instruction designed to close those learning gaps. Now, back to our orange rectangles. So here is how those things are related. Core instruction, which is a bulk of your time. Differentiated instruction and practice, which actually we sometimes call that tier 1 intervention. I don't like to use the word intervention. I'd rather say differentiation, but understanding that that's connected to the core. And then we have this intervention time that sits outside of the core instruction that helps kids close the gap. Finally, what we have to do is pull all of those things together with use of assessment and data, and that's why you see that circle going all the way through each one of those. So let's look at what this means. So assessment and data, two things. It's got to be useful and it's got to be used. And if you think about those two things discretely, just you can have useful assessment data that teachers never use or interventionists never use. You can also have data that's used to try and make instructional decisions, but may not be very useful. And so we want to bring those two things together to make sure that the assessment that we have is useful to help us to get to, remember, that overall goal. And so we need assessment and data that's used to determine the overall health of our system. I'm just going to stop here for a second and say the very next webinar in this series is going to do a deep dive right into this topic. And I really encourage you to register for that webinar, even if you can't make the date, because this idea of assessment and data is super important in terms of helping students get to where they need to get, particularly if they're at risk or behind. So number one, assessment and data must be used to determine the overall health of the system. And some of this is all about screening, understanding where your students are now, understanding where they have come in terms of their progress. And so this will just give you an insight into that. Your assessment and data should also be used to plan small group instruction within the core. And what I mean by that is that differentiation. And we want to understand both student groupings, like who should be in this group and what skills does this group need to target. And so we want to make sure that we have an assessment that will give us the data that we can use to actually do that. We also want to understand areas for personalized practice. So which one of the kids actually needs to repeat this particular skill over and over and over again to ensure they're getting to that place of overgeneralization or mastery. We need assessment and data that will help us identify risk or the need for intervention, along with the skills to target. This is that idea that we need to understand where the gaps are in learning so that we can go back in intervention to target those skills. And then we need this assessment and data to monitor progress and the individual student progress, as well as the effectiveness of how our instruction or how our intervention is progressing. So, that's a lot. And when we think about those things, we're going to think about, okay, I'm going to go back to this actually. We've got this core instruction. We've got this differentiated instruction and practice. We now understand when intervention takes place. We get this idea that the data needs to bring all those things together to inform the overall system. What we're talking about when we're talking about bringing all that together then is alignment. Alignment in the instructional materials you're using in the classroom, alignment with the intervention that's happening outside of the core instruction, and alignment with the assessment to ensure that we're monitoring this whole process adequately. So we're going to stop and take a quick poll, and I want you to think about your literacy program alignment right now. And on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 meaning low alignment and 5 meaning completely aligned, how well do you think your district or school's literacy program is aligned to the science of reading or the simple view of reading? And so I'll just give you a minute to put your answers in there, a scale of 1 to 5, low to high. I'm just guessing like a lot of people might go at 3. That's always my default to say if I don't know one end or the other. All right, let's see how we did here. Ha! Prediction true here. But anyway, so about 3. And seems to be the highest, but a nice range from 1 to 5. Let's talk a little bit about why alignment is important and what it is that we can ask ourselves about, maybe it's not as aligned as I thought, or maybe it's more aligned than I thought. So here we go. Let's talk about these questions you can sort of ask yourself in terms of your literacy program. First of all, do your core instructional materials support the simple view of reading? And what do I mean by that? Does your core instructional materials teach kids systematic explicit phonics, as well as helping them to develop language comprehension? So remember, it's not one part or the other of the simple view of reading. You have to have both of those elements in your core instructional materials from the first day the kids walk through the door in kindergarten. Second question, are all your students participating in that instruction? One of the things that I saw not uncommon or not infrequently was that often students were being pulled out of core instruction to have intervention, and that should never happen. All students should be participating in that core instruction. It's a place of actually prevention. What do I mean by that? So early grades, right? If we can get the kids the learning that they need to have in the early grades, we can prevent the need for further intervention. And so we want to make sure all students are participating there. The next question you want to ask yourself or think about, either as you're delivering instruction or as you're monitoring instruction, do these students receive differentiated practice that specifically targets their needs based on the core instruction? So that should look like what we learned today or what we learned yesterday. If a kid didn't get it, they should be getting differentiated practice right close to that core instruction so that they don't develop gaps later on in the learning. And then, are you regularly monitoring the student progress on that targeted skill? So sometimes differentiation looks like in a classroom a bunch of kids working in small groups. Well, that may or may not be effective instruction depending on what the kids are doing. So the goal is to get all students to learn to read. And so when we deliver that strong, high quality instruction, we want to make sure we follow up with our differentiated practice that's related to that and that we're monitoring that. The next question you'll want to ask yourself is, does your assessment actually provide information on which of those students need to close gaps and in which skills? So this relates to the intervention part of it. Not so much the right core instruction, but what gaps do kids have and how can we fill them? And then are you using that data to organize the intervention for your students? So it's actually based on some gap closing needs to happen. You organize your interventions, and then you're regularly monitoring student progress with those learning gaps to see if you need to make adjustments. Either make adjustments in groupings or make adjustments in what students need to be learning. So that's all, some questions that you can ask yourself to determine if you have at least a level of alignment in your implementation or in your early literacy program. And remember, the goal is efficiency, right? We want to line all those things up, maximum productivity. We want to get students at grade level, keep them at grade level, as many students as possible with minimum wasted effort. So what does inefficiency look like? Inefficiency looks like not maximum productivity. That's something we're wasting something, failing to make the best use of some kind of time or resources. And what are those, right? So first of all, time. It's in the classroom during the instructional part of the day. Time is essential, right? There's a lot, and I know teachers know this, principals know this, district leadership knows this. we can have a lot of wasted time in the classroom. And if we're not focused on those things that students need to have to become proficient readers, it's a cost, right? So that's a cost of misalignment. Dollars. Another cost of misalignment. You know that intervention is more expensive than prevention. And what I mean by that is if a kid gets to 4th grade and needs a lot of intervention, it's going to cost you a lot more than what it would have cost for you to have strong instructional materials and strong assessment to be able to prevent the need for later intervention. And the other cost of misalignment, I mean, our NAEP scores are reflective of that. Like, we haven't hit the target, right? Students are not learning. And I think, you know, that's our ultimate goal, is to be able to get all students on grade level. So let's go through some science of reading principles then, as we've been thinking about what this looks like in implementation and getting our students where they need to go based on the research. What would be the things that we would say would be super critical to remember and do? Number one, remember that reading is not natural. It can be taught and it must be taught. And so we need to make sure that our program materials, including core instruction, intervention, and assessment, are all helping us support this goal to teach kids how to read. We also know that background knowledge is as critical to comprehension as decoding skills, right? That's that other part of the simple view of reading, the idea that language comprehension is a necessary component, and related to that is background knowledge. Foundational skills instruction must be systematic and explicit, beginning with sounds. So always building from the smallest unit or the phonemes, and then building up from there. Remember, we talked about systematic and explicit, what that means, right? Systematic and explicit are different things, but related and important as we're delivering foundational skills. The instruction has to be engaging. We have to use multiple modes and senses to make sure that learning is not just fun, but that learning is also sticky. Science-based reading instruction reduces the need for intervention. This is the prevention message that allows students to move forward as capable and confident learners. One thing is, do we want kids to all love to read? We do, but we know they're not all going to love to read. What we want to do is make sure they're confident in their reading abilities, and that confidence will help them then enjoy reading more. Science-based reading is really a matter of equity. If we know what works for kids in the early grades to get them to be proficient readers, and we are not delivering that instruction, that isn't right. I don't know what anything that's more inequitable than that. And in the world, in the medical world, if we weren't doing something that we knew was science-based in that world, we would call it something other than a preference, or we would actually call it malpractice. And so since we know what works with kids and how to get them reading, we need to make sure that we're delivering that, which leads us to the very last thing that is super important, is that this is actually the most crucial work of the elementary teacher. We know all the signs, right? If a kid isn't reading by grade level at the end of 3rd grade, there is significant consequences in their future schooling and beyond. And so if it's the one thing that we need to highlight and work really hard at, have an urgent call and message about, it's really getting kids to understand how to read and get them on grade level proficiency. So we have a few more slides that I want to cover before the end, but I would love to stop and see what questions we might have out there. So I do want to say that many of the topics that we have sort of introduced today will give you some ideas of what the upcoming webinars are on, but you may find an upcoming webinar that will also answer your question. All right. I got some questions here in front of me. How can the science of reading be applied to support English learners? This is really important. I think that when we think about developing a new language, we need to think about English language learners being immersed in the same kinds of things that we have English learners immersed in. So this idea that we need to build language comprehension, we need to do the same things. And the way that we can do that with our English language learners is to think about drawing images into conversations about topics, rich topics. And they need to learn the same sort of decoding as anybody needs to learn in terms of reading English. So we can apply these strategies to English language learners as well as they're learning to read. Another question, the simple view of reading and Scarborough rope, are they the same thing? They're related, right? So when we go back to think about what they look like, the simple view of reading is really what does it take to become a proficient reader into, this idea of language comprehension and word recognition. When we apply that in Scarborough, what Scarborough tried to do is then highlight the elements within each one of those. So they're both related. A question about transitioning from a balanced literacy curriculum to a curriculum based on the science of reading. We have an episode of our podcast coming up very soon that we talked to Jack Silva from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, about the process that he went through in order to understand what the system there needed, and how he started really early with professional development, helping his leadership staff understand the science of reading research, and then they sort of jumped in with teaching all kindergarten teachers and then all first grade teachers, and so I'm kind of excited that you'll be able to hear from actual practitioners that have started to make that change. But I think like the very first thing and most important thing would be to get folks to really understand what it takes to become a proficient reader. And another one, how do you get teachers to listen to the science while their teacher prep courses don't teach this? This is really a hot topic. I will tell you that, again, Emily Hanford podcasts through APM reports. You can Google them and find them pretty easily. She talks about this issue. We have other folks talking about this issue across the country. I think what we want to remember is that this is not a teacher blaming time. I remember my undergraduate program, and I never had any instruction in cognitive science as it related to reading, and I had to dig this up on my own. And so I think as learning communities, as building and district leadership folks, where there are so many resources out there now to help us dig in and understand that. Ed Week has done many series of articles and issues that are related to the science of reading. I think there's ways now for teachers to really dig in and uncover and learn what the science says so they can then apply that in their classrooms. All right, well, there are probably many more questions out there. Here's a couple of ways we can get your questions answered. First of all, the next webinars that are coming up in the series, again, if for any reason you think that I'm not sure I can make that time, register for the webinar. You will get a link to it after the recording. So we have connecting the science of reading to assessment. Danielle is going to do a deep dive into assessment and what that should look like in an efficient early literacy system. We have this integrating the science of reading into core instruction. So again, Karen and Megan are going to do a deep dive into what should core instruction look like as it relates to the science of reading. We're going to do an overview of science of reading and CKLA and how those two things come together. and then also the science of reading with both M-Class, which is the Amplify assessment system, combined with Amplify reading. And so I think you'll find all of those very interesting, very relevant, and I'm sure you will learn something new. All great folks. The other thing I would encourage you to do, if you have not yet subscribed to Science of Reading, the podcast, we have several episodes out now. I can't even remember, 7 maybe, not sure. But the goal of this podcast is really to bring experts and practitioners in, so both researchers and practitioners, to talk about elements of the science of reading and what that looks like both in research and then what looks like in classrooms and in schools. I just had the pleasure of recording a couple of episodes, one with Jared Myrical, who is in Tennessee, Jackson, Madison, and just talking about implementation issues. Another with Jasmine Lane, who is in Minneapolis school district right now, and she actually teaches high school and talks about the impact and the effects of the lack of early literacy, an early literacy focus when the kids actually get to her in high school. So just some really fun learning that happens in that podcast. And then we have the Facebook group that we would love for you to join in our community. Just a great way for you to access community resources. So people from across the country, actually across the world, that are coming together to ask questions and solve problems together. And so we would love for you to join that as well. So thank you again for joining. We hope that you continue to be well, do good work, keep in touch with us, and encourage you to, again, join the webinar series, subscribe to those podcasts, and join our Facebook community. So thanks again, and have yourself a great day.